I would just like to offer a few, let's say, a question, a few observations and suggestions. Again, in the spirit of activating or feeding the debate rather than anything else. The question I would like to put forward is the question with respect to the potential of this notion of urban metabolism. We've stumbled on it, and intuitively we seem to feel that there is a lot of traction in this concept. But the question is, what is its real potential? And I would have loved to make a grand statement with respect to this potential, but I don't feel that I'm in a position to do so, and I wonder whether anyone is actually at this point in time. And it's a little bit weird, given that, as we've heard from in Aristide's presentation, for example, that it's hardly a new concept. We've been kicking it around for about, 150, 60 years? Yeah, we saw Marx appear in your presentation. And so it's remarkable that we're still actually, kicking it around. And an interesting parallel, perhaps, is when we go back to the beginning of I think it was the 17th century when William Harvey discovered the principles behind blood circulation. That was a metabolic insight. And almost overnight, it swept away 2,000 years of Galenic medical science, and it put in place the foundation for what we have now as modern medicine. So that was kind of a paradigm shift, almost overnight. But I don't know whether the concept of urban metabolism has the same potential. Maybe that potential has to an extent already been realized. We shouldn't forget that indeed a lot of the grand urban gestures in the 19th century were driven by metabolic considerations. Haussmann has been, with the sewer system, and so maybe we've forgotten, part of the rationale behind this notion of metabolism, and we need to rediscover it. Is it because we are lacking the data? I mean, the data scarcity has been, referred to a number of times in the masterclass, but maybe it is also because we have to learn to ask the right questions again. And I was interested by your suggestion that, for example, Dirk, that we need to rethink the relationship between, the human and nature, or the urban and nature. Maybe we need to reconceptualize that in order to formulate the right questions. Maybe we need to reposition ourselves with respect to the concept of space. I mean, we're used to thinking of space in terms of, Euclidean flatness, extension. But maybe we need to think in terms of more active and more fluid, malleable concepts of space that allow us to ask new questions about metabolism. And so from my point of view, that's a big question mark that is hovering about or over our debate. Now, an observation that No, actually, it's not just talking points. I think this one is a really good kind of summary, as you said, of the whole debate. One observation that those who have followed the 3 masterclasses have perhaps made is that there is a considerable variety or heterogeneity in the jargon, in the discourse, and also in the disciplinary vantage point that we take in order to talk about or approach this notion of urban metabolism. So we've heard very different stories, and I would like to perhaps do a few suggestions in order to create some form of order in that kind of mixture almost. One is that I would like to make a distinction between different intentions or purposes when we talk or work with urban metabolism. I think we can make a distinction between, on the one hand, mapping a metabolism. We've seen some examples of and visualizations of a metabolism, a system of flows. A second purpose or intention could be to design a metabolism. So, for example, and circularity is perhaps one guiding theme in designing a particular kind of metabolism, but yet, for example, Jan Jongen in the first masterclass, who was referring to this kind of peer-to-peer logic as a foundation to design a particular kind of metabolism, which may or may not have circular characteristics. And then there is the discipline or the intention to design with a metabolism. And I think naturally, I think that urban designers or landscape urbanists or landscape architects approach this whole field from that vantage point. So they start from their own disciplinary basis as designers, and they try to integrate metabolic notions in that craft and almost. So I think it's maybe useful to look through these three lenses, mapping a metabolism, designing a metabolism, and designing with a metabolism as different intentions or objectives we might have when, approaching this field. Another notion that has been cropping up time and again is the one of system. It has been said time and again that the metabolic perspective offers a systemic perspective on what? Well, the environment, that surrounds us. And I'd like to unpack that a little bit because I think that depending upon the disciplinary vantage point with which we approach this notion of metabolism as a system, we get different things that come into the picture. If we approach it from an industrial ecological point of view, then the systemic aspects manifest themselves as an ability or a willingness to reconceptualize the basic notion of waste, to the ability or the willingness to think in terms of circularity and closed loops, and also the desire to aim for a system-wide optimization. I think these are systemic elements that are naturally associated to an industrial ecological point of view. Something that has been much less mentioned today, we had some references to Odum. Odum is a systems ecologist, and I think systems ecologists have other concerns. The systems ecologists, they are dealing with understanding how complex living systems adapt themselves to changing environments. So this is the notion of resilience, of viability, of adaptiveness. And so there we connect to the ideas and the concepts in complexity science, such as emergence and autopoietic systems. So there we got a different light, so to speak, spotlight on systemicity of metabolisms. And then there is a notion that has actually been very little discussed, and I'm happy that today it appeared in your presentation, Dirk, in the transition from matters of fact to matters of concern, because there we enter the political arena. And so political ecology is one important lens I think we can use to look at urban metabolism. And again, if we approach it then from a systemic angle, new questions appear. Because political ecologists are interested in understanding how forms of social organizations interact with the natural environment. And this is basically a question of governance. And if we phrase it in a systemic way, it is the question of how we can organize this governance as a learning system, as a social learning system, in order to deal with, well, the dynamics of those natural systems. So depending upon the disciplinary vantage point, the notion of system and connected to metabolism gets a different meaning. And I think it's useful to keep that in mind. Then what always strikes me, and this is where, where my own intellectual biography almost comes into play, is actually the very different worlds that engineers on the one hand and designers on the other hand seem to inhabit. I have more an engineering background, and I've been exposed in my, let's say, in my career to designerly contexts numerous times, and I've often, and maybe it's my own limitations, observed that it is very difficult, although we use very often the same language, to really understand each other and to collaborate in a really synergistic way. And so I've noticed that if we listen, for example, to the presentations in the second masterclass and contrasted these with in the first masterclass, very different kind of stories and perspectives. How to bridge those? That's been a question I've been asking myself. My hypothesis is, and I'm not sure whether I'm here on the right track, but it's just a hypothesis, is that we need some kind of bridging concepts. And I've mentioned it in the discussion after the second masterclass. I used the notion of heuristic. A heuristic is a rule of thumb. It is something, an idea that allows us to ask sensible questions. And so I wonder whether we need to, whether there is a place for or an opportunity for identifying very specific design heuristics based on our increasing knowledge about metabolisms. For example, I think circularity has that potential to an extent. It could be one, but only one heuristic to make that, to bridge that almost kind of engineering perspective with a design perspective. But there must be other ones. I wonder, Dirk, in your presentation, you refer to the readability of landscape, and you refer to the presence of clear contours or frontiers or boundaries, and other characteristics of the landscape, so to speak. Maybe readability is an interesting heuristic. Lola Shepherd talked about extrinsic urbanism. That to me seemed also to have a potential as a heuristic for design. I'm somewhat familiar with, for example, the work of Secchi and Vigano. I thought that the notion of porosity and of isotropy is a very interesting and powerful heuristic. Again, it connects to a metabolic reality, but it offers a very powerful kind of lever for designers to start doing their creative work. And maybe we need also to find inspiration with social geographists like Doreen Massey. She talks about thrown togetherness. Maybe that's an interesting heuristic. It would be lovely, I think, or interesting to have a library of those heuristics in order to enable us to make that connection between those different disciplinary and conceptual realms. So that's a few ideas with respect to how to deal with the disciplinary and discursive heterogeneity and that we have been confronted with in these masterclasses. And a final point I would like to approach is the one of agency. Not action. I would like to stick to the word agency. So I think the metabolic perspective offers an opportunity for design for agency. And agency in Dutch, I would say handelingsvermogen. So it's different from actie. So handelingsvermogen, empowerment basically. So I think that's the metabolic vantage point. And again, of course, there's a very emphatic connection here with the political perspective. I think it offers a platform for connecting to many other urban agendas that are today, very pressing agendas such as integration and employment and other, pressing social issues. I think this also resonates with what Julie in her presentation observed in the course of her research, that it's not only, and also your assertion, that it's not only about spatial concepts, but it's also about the processes, building coalitions, which is it's a political given. So how can we do that? And who gets a voice in those processes? And remember, those who were there in the second masterclass, we had a fairly lengthy debate after the presentations by the speakers on the ethical, principles underpinning the design activity. I think design for agency needs to be a kind of guiding motto in this area, in using metabolism as a vantage point or a starting point for urban interventions. And in that sense also, I would like to suggest, and I'm happy again, I was really, it's quite easy to build on what has been said before today. We've been talking about water, we've been talking about materials, we've been talking about energy, but we've hardly talked about information and data, indeed. We've hardly talked about biotic flows, indeed, or genetic flows. And something that has hardly been mentioned is actually financial flows. And if we talk about what makes a city tick, then I think financial flows are of primary consideration. And there must be a wealth of elements, building blocks, functional building blocks, be it taxes or complementary currencies or whatever it is, that we can weave into our designerly proposals and concepts, and so as to have much more impact on how cities in their broader environment eventually evolve. And then the final point related to this more political dimension is that there must be an opportunity to leverage urban metabolism, not only to design spaces, to design agency, but also to design decision makers' opinions. And again, that's what I think absolutely Bruno Latour is concerned with when he says, you know, we have to make the jump from matters of fact to matters of concern. So, and I'm reminded of Buckminster Fuller. He has been mentioned already before in the masterclasses, you know, with his almost visionary scheme of the geoscope, you know. The geoscope, which was actually a visualization system that had to be present in every city in the world, that showed where natural resources were present and what the flows of these natural resources over the world were, with the ultimate intention, you know, to make people sensitive to that and to eventually make sure that, you know, as a global society, we would work towards a global peaceful society. But I think there is something to that idea, and that dynamic visualization you showed of NASA with the carbon sources and sinks is an amazingly powerful tool, you know, to mobilize and to shape public opinion. And that, again, I think is a variable that needs to be integrated into our brief, you know, as engineers, designers, when we try to maximize the potential of urban metabolism. And so these were the talking points I wanted to offer. Thank you.